Hi everyone and welcome to today's session. Now, what we're going to be having a look at is the effects of tectonic hazards. So essentially, when an earthquake occurs, what impact does that have? Now, we're going to be classifying these as primary and secondary effects. And I'm saying that now just to give you a chance to start thinking about what that word primary might mean and what the word secondary means. Now, all you are going to need for today's session is a pen and a pencil and a piece of paper. Oh, and if you have a ruler, that might be quite helpful because I'm going to get you to draw a table. Now, turn your phone off, shut the door, make sure that you are focused, you have everything you need, and then let's make a start. Okay, so let's make a start on today's session. And as I said in the intro, what we're going to be doing is categorizing the effects and the responses of tectonic hazards. So, can you write the title? And can you make sure it's underlined so it looks really neat? I did say that you would need a ruler. And then, as I say, start to have a think about what those words might mean, primary and secondary. Okay, so first of all, we're going to deal with what we call the effects of tectonic hazards. And predominantly, we are going to focus on earthquakes. So the first thing that I'd like you to do is to have a look at the image that I've put on the screen. Now, that image shows some damage to buildings after an earthquake hit Nepal. Now, I want you to just have a think. If those buildings collapsed, what effects might that have had? How might that have impacted people? So, first of all, and I imagine lots of you thought this immediately, this could result in the death of people. If there were people in those buildings when they collapsed, then really sadly, they might have been crushed by the falling brick and the falling rock. The second thing is, that's somebody's house. So if that was somebody's house, that would mean that they would have nowhere to live. So it could result in them being homeless. The other thing is that actually that building might have been somebody's business, might have been a shop or a workshop or an office. And actually, then if that building collapsed, it would also have an effect on business. Now, what we're going to think about is this. Tectonic hazards, they have what we call primary and secondary effects. Now, a primary effect is one that is caused as a result of the hazard itself, and it's what happens immediately. A secondary effect is usually what we call an indirect impact, and it can occur in the hours or the weeks or the months or even years after the event has taken place. Now, often when we look at photographs, it's really, really easy to imagine what the primary effects might have been, but we have to think a little bit deeper when we think about what the secondary effects are. Now, what I would like you to do is these two key terms are incredibly important. So primary effects, secondary effects. So can I ask you please to just pause the video and make a note of both of those, primary effects, secondary effects. Okay, so what I've put on the screen now is a list of primary and secondary effects of a hazard. And what I would like you to do is to classify these. So the first thing that I would do is use your ruler to draw a table and put primary at the top of one of the columns and secondary at the top of the other. Then we're going to read through these together, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video so that you can add each of these either to the primary or to the secondary column on your table. So, buildings and roads are destroyed by the ground shaking during an earthquake. Food shortages can occur if crops are damaged, livestock is killed, or supply lines are damaged. Earthquakes can trigger tsunamis, which cause enormous waves and coastal flooding. People are injured and killed when buildings collapse. Aid and emergency vehicles cannot access areas which need help. This can cause more deaths. And gas pipes and electricity cables are damaged, cutting off supplies. Now, read these through carefully. There are 3 primary effects and 3 secondary effects. The way that I would go about this is do the ones that you're sure of first, and then leave the ones that you're not as sure of till the end, and then you can hopefully figure out which column they should go in. Right, pause the video now, take your time, think it through, and I'll see you back here in just a second. Okay, so let's go through our answers then. So primary effects, what we should have had is that buildings and roads are destroyed by the ground shaking during an earthquake. It's an immediate effect. People are injured and killed when buildings collapse, also an immediate effect. Gas pipes and electricity cables are damaged, cutting off supplies immediately. It happens because the ground has been shaken. Then we have our secondary effects. Food shortages can occur if crops are damaged or livestock is killed or supply lines are damaged. So the food shortage would be a secondary effect because it wouldn't happen immediately. It would happen either in the hours or the weeks or the months following the tectonic hazard, in this case, an earthquake. Now, this one's always tricky, but earthquakes can trigger tsunamis, which cause enormous waves and coastal flooding. Now, a tsunami is a secondary effect of an earthquake. When the ground shifts, then what can happen is huge columns of water are displaced, and that causes flooding. But that would normally happen in the hours after an earthquake, not immediately. Often when there are earthquakes that take place, tsunami warnings are issued, and the reason being then because people can evacuate to safety, normally to higher land. Last but not least then, aid and emergency vehicles cannot access areas which need help, and as a result of that, it can cause more deaths. So make sure that you've got these in the correct columns. I know this is quite tricky, but the key thing to think about is primary effects are immediate, whereas secondary effects normally happen in the hours, weeks, and months, years afterwards. Right, well done. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now are the responses to tectonic hazards. So essentially, this is what happens after there has been a tectonic hazard. Now, the effects of tectonic hazards lead to what we call immediate and long-term responses. So we have primary and secondary effects and immediate and long-term responses. Now, an immediate response is those that take place within days or weeks of the disaster. Whereas a long-term response is those that takes place for months and years after the disaster. Now, again, these are really critical key terms, so it would definitely be worth pausing the video now and writing them down. When you've done that, have a really good look at the photograph, and I want you to see whether you think that is an immediate or a long-term response. Okay, so having looked at it, that picture shows loading supplies in response to an earthquake that happened in Chile. Now, the supplies will have been sent almost immediately after the disaster took place, which would make this an immediate response. Now, we're going to do a very similar task to the one that I set you a minute ago when we looked at effects, and what you're going to have a look at this time is categorizing the responses as either immediate or long-term. So, before we do that, examine these photographs. Which would you say is a short term, as in an immediate response, and which one would you say is a long-term response? Okay, good. So what we can see is the 2010 earthquake relief effort. That's the picture of the aeroplane and the soldiers loading up water. Now, that was actually an immediate response to the earthquake that took place in Haiti. And the reason was there was a huge shortage of clean water because actually the pipes had ruptured. And as a result, the people couldn't get any drinking water. Now, you guys will know that as human beings, drinking water is probably one of the most important things because without it, in 2 or 3 days, people can die. So one of the immediate responses there was to take the water into Haiti so that people could drink. Now, if we look at the picture that's on the left-hand side, that is our long-term response. Now, what we've got is some engineers down there, and they're actually fixing a water pipe in New Zealand. So New Zealand's had 2 major earthquakes in the last 10 years. So they had one in 2010 and one in 2016. And this is them fixing water pipes. And actually, they were really clever. And what they did was then put water pipes in that were flexible. So if there was ever an earthquake again, those water pipes wouldn't be damaged. So immediate responses, or as I've called them here, short term. Now, I've done that on purpose because immediate and short term mean the same thing. Those phrases are interchangeable. Long-term response, anything that takes a long time. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is this. I would like you to pause the video, read through the list below, and decide which of these you would class as an immediate response and which you would class as a long-term response. So if we go through the list, I've got evacuating people, repair homes and rehouse those whose homes have been destroyed, provide food, water and shelter, improve building regulations so buildings can withstand future hazards, and charities may send aid workers or supplies. So pause the video now, write those sentences out and decide which ones you think are immediate and which ones you think are long term. Okay, so let's go through the answers. So we had evacuating people. That is an immediate response. Now, we often can't evacuate people from earthquakes because, as I say, they don't know when they're going to take place. But certainly for volcanoes, people are normally evacuated if they believe that that hazard is going to happen. Repair homes, repair homes and rehouse those whose homes have been destroyed. So that would be a long-term response. It's not something that you can do and fix within hours or within a few days. Provide food, water and shelter. Now, they are the basic 3 human needs. And without food, water and shelter, people die. So that's an immediate response. Now, often when there's been a tectonic hazard like an earthquake, the type of shelter that might be provided might be tents. It could be temporary accommodation. But it is something that we do for people as soon as possible after a hazard. Okay, improving building regulations, so buildings can withstand future hazards. That's really important, but it is absolutely a long-term response to a hazard. And then charities may send aid workers or supplies. Now, that is an immediate response. And there are a really huge number of charities that can do that. They will send personnel, they will send supplies like food and water and help people that have been the victim essentially of a natural hazard so that they can survive in the next few days and few weeks. Give yourself a tick for each one that you got correct. Correct any of them that you got wrong. Don't worry if you did, happens. And then let's crack on and do the main task for today's session. Okay, so this is the main task in today's session. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to use the photograph and your own knowledge explain the primary and secondary effects of earthquakes. Now, what's important here is that this is a 4-mark question, and you're being asked to explain, and you're being asked about primary and secondary effects, and you're being asked to use the photograph. Now, it sounds like a lot, and geography questions can be like this. They can often ask you to do multiple things in just one question. So what I've done is I've given you a little tick sheet which has got the success criteria on it. Now, essentially, you need to refer directly to what has happened in the photograph. Is it a primary or a secondary effect? So let's deal with that first. Looking at that photograph, what can you see? Okay, so you can see that cars have been damaged because the building above it has collapsed. So that is our primary effect. Now, you need to use the words in the photograph it shows, because then you are directly referring to the picture. And then you can use that as your primary effect. The buildings have collapsed, and as a result, the cars have been damaged. Then we need a secondary effect. So that one you need to do either from memory or from looking at the table that we created earlier in the session. Now, the way I would lay this out is I would have one short paragraph about a primary effect, one short paragraph about a secondary effect. And then the last piece of advice from me is make sure that you use those connecting words to show that you're explaining. So you might want to say, this means, as a result of, then. They are all words that show that you are developing your point and going into detail about what has happened. So pause the video now. We'll be back in just a second to go through the answers. Okay, so let's go through our answer now. So, primary effects of earthquakes include buildings collapsing as a result of the ground shaking. Now, I get a mark there because I've said buildings collapsing, but I've also told the person reading it why, and that's because the ground is shaking. So it's always worth adding in that extra little bit of detail to make it really clear as to why something's happening. Then I do what the question asks and I refer to the photograph. So the photograph shows a car which has been crushed as a result of falling debris. Now, debris basically means the rocks that fell on top of the car. It's just a posh way of saying it. So if you wrote as a result of falling rocks or falling building materials, totally fine. Then the second part I wrote was a secondary effect of an earthquake would be food shortages. So I get the mark for identifying that it's a secondary effect and for saying that that creates food shortages. Then as a result of crops being destroyed and livestock being killed. That's me explaining why the food shortages have taken place. Right, 2 things I'd like you to do, please. 1, can you go through your answer and can you highlight any of the key terms that you've used and any of the connectives that you've used? Then, can I ask you please to mark it? So to give yourself a mark. And if for some reason you got 3 marks or you got 2 marks, then just add in the extra bits that you need. That's the beauty of these sessions. Take your time, perfect it. When you're at school, normally, you might have to push on to the next activity. But actually, at the moment, you've got all the time that you can dedicate to this to make sure that you get it perfectly right. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session. And what we have worked on then is categorizing the effects and the responses of tectonic hazards. So just to recap, to make sure you're really clear, what we have is primary and secondary effects, primary being the ones that happen immediately as a result of the hazard, whereas the secondary effects happen in the hours, the weeks, the months, or the years afterwards. And then we've got immediate, or remember, I also called it short-term responses and long-term responses. So when we think about responses to a hazard, an immediate or short-term response is something that will happen in the first kind of few hours or maybe the first few days after the hazard has taken place. Or the long-term responses, they're the ones that take place over months and years and can help to get the economy back in place, help people that have been made homeless refind their homes, those kind of things. Now, again, it is really good practice for you to go back through the notes that you made this lesson and just highlight anything that you think is really important and worth remembering for our next session. I'm really proud of the work that you've done today, and I hope that I will see you in our next session.